Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Nebraska Solve Climate by 2030 panel. My name is Amelia Long, and I am an undergraduate environmental studies major at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Today's panel is being hosted by the UNL Environmental Studies program as part of the Solve Climate by 2030 initiative out of the Center for Environmental Policy at Bard College. This is one of over 100 webinars occurring globally in the next couple weeks to talk about climate change solutions and how people can get involved. We're so excited to have you here today. Here's what the event will look like. We'll have a short introductory video from one of the organizers at Bard, followed by 10 to 15-minute presentations from each of our three panelists. Then the second half of the panel will be a Q&A session. If you think of any questions as panelists are speaking, feel free to put them into the Q&A function you can see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can use the chat for any technical problems or if a panelist asks you to share something. Just as a note, no bigotry or trolling of any kind will be tolerated in the chat, so please keep it respectful. Thank you all for being here today, and let's hear from Vivian Nguyen at Bard College.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 US states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Vivian Nguyen, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the two hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinars homework for the students and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forward, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Okay, so now we'll be hearing from our panelists. Our first panelist is Nebraska native Tim Rinne, who has been the state coordinator of Nebraskans for Peace since 1993. A career political organizer, he is a co-founder of both the Lincoln-Lancaster County Food Policy Council and the Nebraska Food Council. Along with his wife, Kay Walter, and his neighbors, Tim helped create the award-winning Hawley Hamlet neighborhood garden in their Lincoln City block. And while the public attention is nice, it's getting kind of weird since all they're doing is growing some of their own food and getting to know their neighbors, something humans have been doing for thousands of years. His recent article, The Tale of the Hamlet, can be found in the spring 2021 issue of Yes magazine.
Good evening. I want to thank you all for joining this Solve Climate by 2030 webinar. For as you all well know, there's no more urgent issue facing us than the climate crisis, and this isn't an easy subject to grapple with. The by 2030 date in the title particularly punctuates the emergency of solving the climate problem. We're on a clock, trying to meet the deadline set by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its special report from 2.5 years ago. According to that 2018 report, the world community has to cut greenhouse gas emissions by half between now and 2030 if we're to limit global climate temperatures to a degree Celsius rise of no more than 1.5. And for those of us living in the US, where we have the highest per capita carbon footprint in the world, cutting greenhouse gas emissions in half roughly amounts to middle-class Americans cutting their lifestyles in half. Half the energy consumption, half the transportation and travel, half the shopping, half the dietary choices, half the impact we're currently having on the planet's ecosystem. Now, this isn't anything anybody wants to hear. I can tell you that I sure didn't, and I still don't. But it's important to remember that 4 out of 5 people in the world have never even been on a plane. 4 out of 5 people in the world don't own a car. Middle-class Americans live better than 90% of the world's population. No other country in the world has access to the incredible variety of food we have, where we can eat whatever we want, whenever we want, regardless of the season, or consumes anywhere near the meat and dairy we Americans consume daily. And no other nation, accordingly, has the capacity to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions the way that we do. Comparatively, the rest of the world doesn't have much. People can't cut what they don't have. So those with the most have the most to cut. And from those with the most is required. It's a matter of both basic arithmetic and environmental justice. So this is the setting we find ourselves in, with 9 years to reduce global emissions by half, with the remaining half to be cut by 2050. This is a tall order, admittedly one that's going to require major shifts in our thinking and our behavior. But let's stop for a moment, though, to think about what we in America have gotten with this outsized carbon footprint of ours. We've gotten a polluted, gutted planet with fouled air, fouled land, and fouled water, with undegradable plastic in our landfills, our oceans, and even microplastics in our bodies. We've gotten a coronavirus outbreak that's directly related to the relentless industrial and agricultural encroachment on the natural world. The entire planet is now experiencing a massive biodiversity loss event, the sixth extinction. We've gotten the biggest wealth divide in human history, with the top 1% of the US population holding 15 times more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. In 2018, 3 white men at the top of that list: Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, Microsoft founder Bill Gates, and investor Warren Buffett, held combined fortunes worth more than the total wealth of the poorest half of Americans. We've gotten a social structure that's as institutionally rife with white male privilege as ever. Societies with authentic equality before the law and equal opportunity don't need to be having a national dialogue on race 150 years after the end of the Civil War. They don't have to be explaining in 2021 that Black lives matter, or to be dealing with deeply embedded institutional racism in every aspect of their lives. Nor in societies where true equality prevails do women have to mount a hashtag Me Too movement to counter pervasive sexual harassment and discrimination. And finally, for our carbon footprint, we've gotten a global war machine that's spending more on war making than ever before. In a world already beset by pandemic and climate crisis, the US government is currently embarked on a $1 trillion modernization of its nuclear weapons arsenal so we can even more effectively kill all life on Earth. I'm a boomer. As by far the oldest person on this panel, by design, I'm going first tonight because it was my generation that promulgated this consumption-crazed throwaway society that's launched us down this self-destructive path. My generation took consumption and the pursuit of material wealth to never-before-seen heights. 30 years ago, you could actually see bumper stickers on cars with billionaire Malcolm Forbes's brag that he who dies with the most toys wins. He who dies with the most toys wins. With its vulgar ideology that getting more is all that matters and we'll get it whatever the cost. This selfish, cynical worldview has pushed us to the cusp of civilizational collapse. Apart from being morally hideous, it's unsustainable. And to preserve the ecosystem, we need to step back from the brink and seek another path. And there are other paths that we can take. Everybody knows about the boomers, but we don't talk as much about the generation just preceding them. My parents' generation. They grew up during the Great Depression, lived closer to the land, knew the value of local community, came of age at the start of World War II, rallied together to deal with hardship, with rationing and separation from loved ones. They grew victory gardens to support the national war effort. They feared for the future because no more than us, they didn't know how things would turn out in World War II. But they never gave up hope and they never quit. We revere and celebrate them today as the greatest generation. They were heroic, common folks, but heroes nonetheless. They didn't fly. They didn't go to the mall. They ate only what was available in season. But they knew how to live and to love and to care for their homes and communities and to be grateful for what they had. And there were things that we can learn from them. Not everything, of course. There was rampant, horrific racism, sexism, and homophobia then too, and greed and jealousy and small-mindedness. But when the world hung in the balance, they rose to the greatest challenge they'd ever face in their lives. The whole Earth, our entire global ecosystem, now desperately needs another greatest generation. And I'm hoping All of you will rise to this new challenge and step up to help chart a new course for the planet as we build back better. What your generation chooses to do will determine our collective future. There's tons to be done, and anything anybody does is helpful. But given the narrow window for action we have, it's going to be imperative to work smart, to do the most we can given what we have to work with, because the next 9 years are critical and we have to get moving. So, what's the smartest thing we should be doing? This is not a dodge when I tell you, only you can decide that for yourself. You best know your personal strengths and interests, your living situation, your political environment, and the possibilities for action. But having said that, I do have some thoughts gleaned from my 40 years as a political organizer here in Nebraska. Generally, in a talk like this is the moment when speakers exhort you to contact your members of Congress. Well, I'm not going to tell you not to, because they need to hear their constituents care about climate change. But Nebraska's all-Republican federal delegation is not going to climb the climate barricades anytime soon. Even the ones who authentically understand the climate science, like Representatives Jeff Fortenberry and Don Bacon, are not going to buck the Republican leadership in Washington or run the risk of alienating the Trump political base when they have to run for re-election every 2 years. So by all means, contact your 2 senators and your district member of Congress. But know that this will be a long slog, and it may not produce much in the way of concrete results when we need them to move fast. Sadly, things aren't much better in the Nebraska legislature. Governor Pete Ricketts is an out-and-out climate denier, and the legislature is heavily populated with deniers and obstructors. They too need to hear from their constituents, and we should continue to lobby them. But again, don't hold your breath. On the other hand, as you'll hear next from Kim Morrow, the city of Lincoln just adopted a climate action plan on a bipartisan vote. Climate impacts will be considered with every action city government takes from this point forward. Getting that to happen was the result of literally years of organizing, meeting with local officials, speaking to groups, trying and failing and retooling and trying again. But now Lincoln is positioned to be a model and a laboratory for climate mitigation and adaptation that other communities can adapt to their own circumstances. Wherever you are, whatever your situation, there's something you can do politically to advance the work of climate action. You'll want to take some time to study and identify the courses of best action suited for you. Whether it's prodding a public body, city council, county commission, school board, public power district, natural resources district, board of regents of the university, or whether it's modeling a leaner, less consumptive lifestyle for your social network, such as eating a more plant-based diet, riding your bike instead of driving, or my own personal passion, growing some of your own food. I'll close my remarks with a little background about the neighborhood garden we've established in our city block in Lincoln, the Hawley Hamlet. Food is the foundation of everything we do. None of us would even be on this webinar tonight if we hadn't eaten something at some point today. And though we eat almost constantly, we almost never think about our food system. Those of us who live in the city see our role in the food chain as merely that of consumers, as eaters, not producers. But like just about everything else, our global food system is in crisis. The extreme weather of climate change will make it harder to grow food, decreasing yield, just as a growing world population is increasing overall demand. As of this instant, the average bite of food that we eat travels 2,000 miles to get to our mouths. Even here in Nebraska, the renowned breadbasket of the world, 90% of the food that we eat is imported from outside the state. Fully dependent on this global food distribution system, the typical grocery store and restaurant stocks just 3 days worth of inventory, just 72 hours, because they wait for the next trucks to come in. And the COVID pandemic has shown us just how easily that global distribution system can break down, leading to food shortages. Growing some of our own food and relocalizing our own food supply increases the odds that we'll always have something for dinner. As a state, Nebraska needs to start shifting its agricultural system from its myopic focus on growing livestock feed, our corn and our soybeans, to again growing food for human consumption. But those of us living in the urban environment can also start doing our part by growing what we can. While we don't have the room in our yards or on our balconies to grow calorie crops like grains and dry beans and potatoes, we can grow perishable fruits and vegetables better than anyone else, because they're harvested right here on site, right outside our kitchen door. And what we grow is fresher and therefore more nutritious. 12 years ago, my wife and I began digging up our grass lawn to put in an edible landscape and establish the first garden in our block. Today, in a block with no vacant lots, 20 of our neighbors now annually garden an area the equivalent of 80 yards of a football field, sideline to sideline, growing both food and neighborhood. We grow lettuce and strawberries, carrots and cucumbers, beets and green beans, zucchini, tomatoes, and peppers. We call our block the Hawley Hamlet, after the Hawley neighborhood we live in. People who lived in the same block together for years and never even knew each other's names now garden side by side. We're not going to feed ourselves, and in and of itself, we know this isn't going to solve the climate problem. But we're making better use of what little ground we have in the city core, growing some food for our tables, and we're building community, which is what we're going to be needing a lot more of if we're going to cut our carbon emissions as drastically as we need to. I'll just end by saying that while I have no illusions about how hard this transition is going to be in the coming years, I've never been prouder to be a citizen of Lincoln. I wouldn't want to live anywhere but in the Hamlet with my fellow Hamleteers. And looking at you guys tonight, I can't shake the feeling that right now I'm looking at the greatest generation America has seen yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Our next panelist is Kim Morrow. Kim serves as Director of Climate Planning and Resilience at Verdis Group, a sustainability consulting company. In this role, she guides communities through a process to understand, prepare for, and thrive in the midst of impacts from our changing climate. She recently led the climate action planning process for the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, and is currently leading a similar project for the city of Salem, Oregon. She has a background working with faith communities on climate change, and in 2015 was honored at the Obama White House as a champion of change.
Thank you, Amelia. And it's great to be here with you all. Tim Rinne is a hard act to follow, but I will do my best. As Amelia mentioned, if you go to the next slide, Amelia, I am the Director of Climate Planning and Resilience at Verdis Group. And I just wanted to point that out because my understanding is the goal of this webinar is to highlight Nebraska-specific climate actions. And I just want you all to know that we are a sustainability firm that was actually founded in 2009. So we've been around for a little while, and we have 11 people now. We're soon to have 14 people altogether. So we're trying to change the conversation in Nebraska and in our region, and we are working nationally now. So it's really interesting work, and we're hoping to contribute to the conversation as much as we can. Next slide. So starting in 2019, I had the great honor of being able to serve as project lead in the project to develop a climate action plan for Lincoln. This was one of Mayor Lyrin Gaylor Baird's first priorities when she took office. And so we got right to work that summer of 2019. And we ended up creating ultimately what became 2 documents. This was the first and longest document. It's now titled Lincoln's Vision for a Climate Smart Future. And you can find this and the actual climate action plan that was voted on by the City Council on the city website there. I put the URL, keyword resilient. You can find these documents. Next slide. So the first and longer document basically represents a study and a climate assessment of Lincoln's projected future climate and its vulnerabilities, and a lengthy list of strategies that we recommended the city should take to address its climate vulnerabilities and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of Lincoln's future climate, these are some of the ways that our climate here is expected to change. So definitely warmer and more days of extreme heat, which is of particular concern because that is the most deadly climate impact. Increase in precipitation in winter and spring. You may have noticed that in recent years that we seem to be getting more frequent heavy downpours and more, actually this winter we had more snow than normal, and those are consistent with the trends and projections. At the same time, we're projected to have less rain in summer and an increase in heavy precipitation that might take the form of rain or snow. Next slide. And so from there, we did more research, we talked to a lot of people, and we kind of cross-checked these climate trends with social and cultural vulnerabilities that currently exist in Lincoln. So we looked at areas where there are areas of high poverty. We looked at where there are floodplains, where there have been previous floods. We looked at the kinds of health risks that may be coming down the pike. And these are the 12 climate risks that we identified that are most important for Lincoln to address. And they're not really in order of importance, but the first 3 are certainly probably the most important. Lincoln's flood risk. If any of you lived here in 2015, you might remember we really had a historic flood at that time that almost became quite dangerous. And we've had many other floods in recent years. We also had a historic drought in 2012. So we're seeing some of those whiplash between extremes already, and those kinds of trends are expected to continue. We also only have a single source of water, which was also threatened recently in 2019 in the historic bomb cyclone event that impacted our water collection facilities in Ashland. So the city knows that they need to identify a second source of water, and the findings of our climate assessment just underscored the importance of those efforts. And some of the other risks that Lincoln faces have to do with some of the things Tim was just talking about. We need to strengthen our local food supply. We need to think in different ways about transportation so that we're not always driving single occupancy vehicles to get where we need to go. And we need to protect our natural resources and protect vulnerable populations especially. Next slide. The pandemic began during this project, so it was an interesting experience to go through a pandemic, and we got to see firsthand some of the kinds of effects that previously were only theoretical to many people's minds. Like we had talked about how Lincoln only has about a 3-day supply of food in all of our grocery stores, and that those supply chains could be disrupted due to weather events and international supply chains. And sure enough, when the pandemic happened, we all experienced different kinds of shortages in our grocery stores that I don't think many of us had ever seen before. So we learned several things from that pandemic that are very applicable to our climate threats. We know that sudden shocks can have enormous consequences. There are all kinds of cascading effects from disasters, that vulnerable populations will be hit the hardest, but also that we can reduce emissions. We have globally and nationally reduced emissions quite a bit during this year of the pandemic. And while it's not a recipe necessarily for climate action, it did show us that it is possible for us to reduce our emissions. And also the crises bring unexpected consequences, and benefits. And that's certainly applicable to the climate crisis as well. The last thing is that social capital matters. Studies have shown that communities that have stronger social bonds between people are those that recover more quickly from natural disasters, and that they even recover more quickly than those communities who have higher financial resources. So the relationships between people, whether you have someone to lean on when you're in the midst of a tough time, whether you have neighbors who will come help you clean up after a storm, that kind of thing really influences a community's climate resilience. Next slide. We also looked at intersections with socioeconomic trends. So we looked at the growing poverty trends that are affecting Lincoln. We looked at the growing, the aging population and the number of seniors who are likely to make up a significant portion of the population by 2050. We even looked at issues like climate migration. Lincoln will probably be in a better place than some places on the coasts and in the South. And it may be that Lincoln gets more new arrivals because we will be able to maintain a better quality of life than some other places. So we looked at some of those trends that helped us see even more clearly what our climate vulnerabilities are. Next slide. We also approached this plan with a clear eye toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we tried to look particularly at how systemic issues of racism and income inequality may affect, well, currently affect Lincoln and may continue to affect it in the midst of climate change. So this map is just one example of that. We mapped the city of Lincoln's areas of high poverty, and then we overlaid that with our floodplain map. And that showed us, you can see especially the area right around the stadium, actually in the North Bottoms area, is the place where we have the highest number of low-income folks, and also they are at risk of flooding from Salt Creek. If Salt Creek were to overtop the levees there, those residents would experience flooding. And that's also a neighborhood where there are mostly renters, not homeowners, and they may not have renters insurance to protect their property that may be at risk during a flood. So those are the kinds of findings that will help the city of Lincoln direct its outreach efforts in the months and years to come. Next slide. So this is the cover of the actual 6-year climate action plan that the city presented to the city council just a couple of weeks ago. March 22nd, I believe, was the date it went before the city council. And what the city did is they made a slimmed down, more actionable plan that included about 120 strategies that fall clearly within the jurisdiction of the city to act on. And they noted which ones of those might need future funding support and which ones relate more to changing practices that the things the city is already doing. Next slide. So the actual climate action plan has 3 components of a strategic vision. And the first is that climate directions and climate resilience will be integrated throughout city actions and ordinances going forward. The second vision is simply that Lincoln will be resilient to the climate hazards it will face. And the third big one is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the target that we arrived at there is what's known as an 80 by 50 goal that many cities around the country have adopted. And it is that Lincoln will reduce emissions 80% by 2050 relative to 2011 levels. Next slide. So the climate action plan is divided into 8 action areas, and those range from transitioning to low carbon energy, to building a decarbonized and efficient transportation system, to aligning economic development goals with climate realities, improving protections for Lincoln residents. As Tim said, building a resilient local food system is a huge area where there's so much opportunity, and it makes so much sense for us as an ag state to really strengthen our local food system. Also to maximize our natural climate solutions, the ways in which we can sequester carbon naturally, and also the ways in which we can slow down floodwaters by increasing riparian buffers along our streams, can have huge impacts in helping us become more climate resilient. The seventh one is to reduce waste. And finally, the eighth is to engage residents in co-creating a climate smart future, because none of this matters too much if we can't engage all residents to be part of the solutions. Next slide. So I'll just walk through these really quickly. These are those 7 action areas. So transitioning to low carbon energy. I'll just say that our local electric utility, Lincoln Electric System, concurrently made a big commitment to move to renewable energy by 2050. So that is going to go a long, or 2040, excuse me. That's going to go a long way toward helping Lincoln achieve its emission reduction goals from the energy sector. Next slide. The other main sector where our emissions come from is transportation, and that's a little harder to get toward because that's all of us, right? It's all of us driving our vehicles. And so there's a range of strategies there that point to improving public transit, making it easier for people to bike to work. We have an incredible bike network already, but incentivizing and encouraging those active commuting modes. Next slide. Economic development was an important part of this climate action plan. It's one that I felt was really exciting because there are a lot of people working on Lincoln's economic development anyway, wanting to strengthen what we do here and build entrepreneurship, build local companies, and also attract other companies to come here. So the more that we can align those with, for example, the research that's coming out of UNL on renewable energy sources, on water and soil health, on a range of other issues, the more we can incentivize and grow those local businesses right here in a way that makes sense. We also want to incorporate our vocational college, Southeast Community College, into these efforts. So we're training workers to, for example, to be energy efficiency technicians or wind turbine technicians or electric vehicle technicians. So that this effort to expand our economy, make it more of a green economy, really provides opportunities for all people. Next slide. Improving protections for Lincoln residents is very important. As I mentioned before, we have this flood risk, and we want to make sure that people know about the risk they live with and have taken appropriate precautions. Next slide. Building a resilient local food system, we've already discussed that one, how important that is and how much community support there is for that effort as well. Next slide. And maximize natural climate solutions. As I said a moment ago, our ability to sequester carbon and deal with floodwaters naturally is a really great opportunity we have before us. Next slide. Sorry about that. Finally is to reduce waste. The more we can compost our food scraps and improve our waste diversion rate, the more we're going to reduce emissions in our system, and also reduce, the more we reduce our consumption to begin with, the more we can reduce our waste. And reducing consumption, of course, avoids creating all of those emissions in the first place. Next slide. And the last is to engage our residents. So incorporating all of these considerations into the city's comp plan, Lincoln is creating its next comprehensive plan right now, and so all of these recommendations are will be taken up into that comprehensive plan and sort of solidified as part of the city's long-range plan. And there's also so much we can do with outreach and educational programs to get all of Lincoln residents on board with this effort. Next slide. So I want to close with just a recommendation of 2 books and a set of ideas that I really recommend. As much as I work on these kind of wonky and technical solutions to climate change, I'm really inspired by the writings of a couple of people here. And this book recently came out. It's by Christiana Figueres, who is the lead negotiator in the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. And she and her co-author talk about how the most powerful thing you can bring to changing a system is your state of mind. And they talk about how difficult that climate meeting was and how hopeless all the representatives from all the world's countries felt. And what they had to do was to really shift mindsets and to create a culture of possibility. So they came away from that really feeling how important it is to shift our minds and our mind space. And they say in this quote, in order to open the space for transformation, we have to change how we think and fundamentally who we perceive ourselves to be. And Tim kind of touched on that too. We're in the midst of a generational change where we're rethinking our very relationship to nature, to consumerism, to wealth, and to each other. And it's a really exciting time to do that. These last 3 bullet points there are the main recommendations that Figueres makes in this book. They believe that what is necessary to move into the future is stubborn optimism, endless abundance, and radical regeneration. So I recommend that one to you. And then next slide. The next one I recommend, this is my favorite book of 2020. I love this book. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's by British author Rob Hopkins. And it's about the role of imagination in addressing the climate crisis. And you might think that's just kind of silly or not necessary, but I think this book will convince you of how important imagination is to meet this moment that we are in. Because at the heart of our work is the need to be able to imagine a better world, to be able to tell stories about it. And once we can share stories and recognize stories as a people, we ignite a longing for those stories to be realized. And I absolutely love this quote. I put this in the Lincoln Climate Action Plan. He said, one response to climate catastrophe is to kick against it, to deny it, to say it's impossible. And another response is to look at it as a historic one-off invitation to our brilliance. And I really think that is the invitation that we have in front of us at this moment. So in terms of, I think this webinar series is organized around, what's the one big idea? What's the one idea you can take away to solve climate? And what I'd like to leave with you is, I think it's this question. I would encourage you to ask, what if? And then to ask, why not? So with that, I'll turn it back to Amelia.
Thank you, Kim. Our final panelist tonight is Vivian Nguyen. Vivian is a firm believer that everyone has a role to play in the climate movement. During her tenure at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, she pioneered several sustainability efforts that still stand today. She co-founded Sustain UNL, organized the first Earth Stock, served on the first committee for the ASUN Green Fund, and helped build the foundation of the Office of Sustainability. Vivian now works in international development for the Kaizen Company in Washington, D.C. In her role, she assists the U.S. Agency for International Development to accelerate progress and prosperity in partner countries all over the world.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Amelia. Just wait for my slides to load. So again, kind of just what Kim and Tim said, we were asked to answer this question of what is one big idea to solve climate change by 2030? And we kind of all came with the conclusion that it's not just one big idea. It takes all of us. And so I was a little inspired to try to help you guys figure out your role. And so I was inspired with this theme of heroes because heroes are so ingrained in our society. My nephew Ian, he's been a superhero every single Halloween and probably will be for the next 10 years. And Avengers Endgame is the highest grossing movie of all time. So it's everywhere. And so when I watch Avengers Endgame, hopefully you guys have seen it. I know there are some generational differences in the audience today, but I see a connection with our heroes and what they face in the movie and what we're facing today. So spoiler alert, in Infinity War, Doctor Strange, he tells Tony Stark that the heroes only have one chance to save the universe. And it didn't take the most powerful and strongest superheroes. Actually, we see them get kind of beat up, Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America. But it took every single hero from every walk of life, from different planets, and all of their superpowers to fight and save the planet, or the universe, my God. And I think that if we want to actually solve climate by 2030, we will have to do the same. So next slide, Amelia. So I just want to get some engagement in the chat from all of you. So I want to ask you guys, who do you think are our superheroes, our climate heroes? Put it in the chat. It could be real people in your life, people you see on social media or the news, groups of people. John Kerry, Greta. Greta Thunberg. Brittany, thank you. Yes, Rachel Carson, Wendell Berry, all really great people. My daughters, great. All right, thanks everybody. So a lot of you posted a variety of individuals or roles that people play in the climate movement. But for all you students out there, I know what it feels like when you're a student and you don't really know what your role is in the climate movement because you're still figuring out who you are. And honestly, I still am too. So today I want to give you guys a framework. Oh, sorry, next slide, Amelia. So I want to give you all a framework to help find how you can do your part. So I'm going to discuss, this is going to take a lot of self-reflecting from all of you, how to craft your origin story, reflect on your identities, identify your own superpower, and then lastly, connecting that superpower to purpose. Next slide. So every hero has an origin story, and they almost always involve like a single moment, a challenge, and a choice. So I think the most iconic story is probably Batman or Bruce Wayne. At an early age, he witnessed the murder of his parents who were gunned down by a thief. So in response to his trauma and grief, he began training his body and he became Batman to fight crime at night. And so similarly, I have an origin story, and my story begins in my 9th grade geoscience class at Lincoln North Star. So I was taking this geoscience class and we had to watch the documentary Inconvenient Truth, which was at the time kind of this viral documentary created by Al Gore, where he was trying to raise awareness about climate change and global warming. And so he was presenting this chart of global warming where the planet was like, it was looking like this. Here's the ice age, and then around the Industrial Revolution, it just starts shooting up to the point where like the arrow was no longer on the graph. And after that, I kind of just knew like, this is what I have to do. I have to save the planet and do my part. And so I joined environmental studies once I enrolled in UNL. And it was really exciting because I was finally around students who really cared about what I cared about. But the issue was when I left the classroom, nobody was talking about climate change. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody understood what sustainability was. And, I thought about transferring because I just didn't want to be in that kind of environment. But then I kind of thought about it and I thought like, global warming is a global issue. And if I wanted to make change, I needed to do it where it mattered, not where it was easy. So I decided to stay at UNL, and then I created Sustain UNL with a group of my friends who felt the same. And so the rest is kind of history. And so there was a moment where I realized I wanted to do something about climate change, the challenge of wondering if I should do it, and the deciding that I would do something like creating Sustain UNL. So next story, or next slide. So what makes comic book heroes or superheroes is that they're never two-dimensional. They're always real people, fully fleshed people. They have hobbies, they have quirks, they have families, and of course they have identities. So these are my identities. I'm a first-generation Vietnamese American, and I'm also a Nebraskan. I rep Nebraska everywhere I go, and I'm very proud of it. I'm also a sister and a cool aunt, at least that's self-identified. But I'm also a world traveler. I love birding, and every night I love ending the night with my skincare routine. And lastly, I identify as an environmentalist, and I have worked in about 15 different environmental fields. Next, Amelia. So again, I want engagement from you all. What are some of your identifiers? It could be being a coach, being a teacher, being a mom, etc. I'd love to hear in the chat. Shelby's a sister, a reader, an empath. Brittany's a tree nerd, soon to be aunt, daughter, sister, activist. Dave, I knew you would put coach. So let's go next slide. Thanks, everyone. So just going over why your identity matters. First, it's a crucial role in the actions of all people. It's what you do and how you act. So most folks in this room are from Nebraska. What do Nebraskans do? We go to Husker games and we eat Renzas, but we're also very kind and we look out for each other and take care of each other. So secondly, identity shapes your perspective. So a great example of this can be seen in Black Panther. So I'm about to go into a long analogy here. So as most of you guys know, in Black Panther, there's T'Challa and there's Eric Killmonger. Black Panther, T'Challa, was born as the Prince of Wakanda, the country, a secret and prosperous African country rich in vibranium. He was born with a lot of privilege, protection, and of course, power, being a prince. But his cousin, Eric Killmonger, lost his father at an early age, and then he lived in the United States as a young Black man experiencing systemic racism and discrimination. I guess Wakanda forever. So the conflict that in Black Panther is that the two have opposing viewpoints on whether or not Wakanda should be opened up to the world. They both saw Wakanda as a means of self-preservation. T'Challa believed that Wakanda should remain a secret because he wanted to protect his country, himself, his family, and of course their resources, whereas Killmonger believed that vibranium should be used to arm and liberate Black people all over the world. So you can see through this connection, like identity and your experience plays a role in how you see the world and what you bring to the table. And lastly, it's a strong motivation for when you face adversity. So like I said in one of the previous slides, I'm a world traveler. I love birds. I'm also an aunt. So really, like, I want to save the planet because I want to see everything. I don't want to see everything underwater. But then I also want to make sure that my nieces and nephews can see it too. Next slide. So next, I want to go into superpowers. Everybody has a superpower, and you also could have many. And so these aren't skills. It's not how many petitions you can get in an hour or how many academic papers you can write. This is about your perspective and a mindset. It's basically your Midas touch and what you bring to the table. Next slide. So finding your superpower is pretty easy. It's just one step, at least in my eyes. So you just have to look for the patterns in your life. Look for experiences and moments that you felt were effortless, but yet triumphant. Think of the times where someone said something like, "Oh my God, thank God you were here to save the day." What did you do then? Next slide. So these are my superpowers. First one is that I'm a maverick. Basically, I tend to be a pain in the butt, and I think Dave could probably attest to that here, because I like to challenge rules and I do not like the status quo, and I don't like places that are unjust, unfair, or even just unorganized. The worst thing you can say to a person like me or a maverick is, "This is the way we've always done it." I knew this was my superpower as early as 17 because my first job was at a retail store. And I remember that they just didn't treat us right there. And I remember I spoke up and nothing happened. So I quit, but I also took like 5 or 6 other employees with me. It can also be seen in my origin story as I co-founded Sustain UNL. Thanks, Dave. And of course, I did not follow the rules about how to do this presentation today. The next one is I'm a learner. In one of the previous slides, I put that I have worked in almost 15 different environmental industries. And when that is on your resume, it's a lot and not necessarily always in a good way. Some people might see that as me being a flake or being dissatisfied. But what I've realized from this experience and all of my experiences is that my superpower is learning. I love diving deep into learning new things and learning how things work in different facets of the environmental movement. But I also realized one of my patterns is that I don't just do this about the environmental movement. I will go days and hours into YouTube rabbit holes to learn about other communities or other topics that I'm not really involved in. So recently I've been learning about the autism community, the disabled community, and the trans community. And thanks, Dave. And so my last one is individualization, which I will go over in a few slides. So next slide. So I want to, again, ask you guys, like, there's no right or wrong answers. Do you guys have a superpower? If so, please add it in the chat. I would love to see. Optimism, optimist, good. That's definitely a superpower. Generosity. Shelby's good at remembering names and faces. Curiosity, adaptability. All right, great. Looks like you guys you're thinking about your superpowers. Next slide. So superpowers, let's say heroes aren't heroes unless they use their superpowers for the purpose of good. So let's take an example again. When you think of Professor X or Charles Xavier of the X-Men, he's a telepath, which means that he can read people's minds and he can communicate with people telepathically. This alone doesn't really do anything. Maybe he would really be good at like poker, or he would like know your deepest, darkest secrets. But if he's not using it for good, then he's really not a hero. But what he does do is he uses his telepathy to identify other mutants around the world, communicate with them, and then recruit him to come to his school where they can be protected, connect with other with a community of mutants to understand their identity, but also to hone their superpowers and then to do good. So the whole point of purpose is not really what do I do at work, but what is my work in the world? Next slide. So I wanted to show you some real examples of different climate heroes from a small sample of some of my fellow environmental studies friends. Next slide. So this is Amanda Hefner. She's one of my good friends. She is a conservation coordinator with the Nature Conservancy out in the Niobrara Valley. So she said, I am using my superpowers as a connector to bring people together and with the ecosystems in their backyards by doing outreach with local educators, helping landowners do prescribed fire, and assisting researchers so that Nebraska ecosystems stay resilient and adaptable in the future. So as Amanda's friend, this was really no surprise to me that she chose the word connector, because in our environmental studies department, Amanda was kind of like the token agriculture kid or the like a representative. But when she went to the agricultural spaces, she was kind of seen as like the environmental hippie. So she had two different identities, and these identities helped Amanda have this ability to like shapeshift, but also connect people to one common cause. Next slide. So next is Tian Zhou. Kind of, back then. So Tian is an attorney with the National Sierra Club. So he works on different litigations and different class action lawsuits related to climate change. And so he is using his powers as an advocate to empower communities to utilize legal tools and create a more equitable system that works for all people. So Thien, I remember getting an email from him when he was a little freshman wanting to get involved in the Environmental Sustainability Committee. And just that email alone, I knew that he was going to go really far because in my time of knowing him, he's always been really vocal when he saw that something wasn't right, but he always did it in a really calm, strategic, and informed manner. So becoming a lawyer. But he was such an advocate for students when he was here at UNL that he actually ran for ASUN president and he won. So definitely a man of the people. Next. So last is my good friend, Mariah Lundgren. So she says that she's using her superpower as a storyteller to educate people about water, Great Plains, the American West, in hopes to move the needle forward on conservation. So she is a producer at the Platte Basin Time Lapse. They do all sorts of different documentaries and content creation about the Platte River and the areas around it. And so as my friend, she has always had a creative eye. She was always the friend that would veer off and go take photographs of, interesting things that the rest of us weren't seeing. We were taking like silly Snapchats, but Mariah was actually building content. And she was always the friend to kind of turn like our road trips and stuff like that into like real tangible stories. So next. So like I said, all of these people, the 3 people that we named, they all had the same degree, but they all ended up doing something differently based on their superpower. And now I want to talk about my superpower, my other superpower. So my 3rd superpower is individualization. Individualization is basically having this supervision to see people for who they are and also finding their unique value. So the funny thing is I actually made bets with myself, and I wish I wrote this down because I actually asked all my friends to write these purpose statements, and I got every single superpower down to a T. So connector, advocate, and storyteller. And I didn't like get the synonyms, I got the actual word. So I think this is truly my superpower. So my superpower is I'm using my power of individualization to create validating spaces to help people, like we are here today, to find their own superpower to build will for a better planet. So I wanted to emphasize the word better planet because your purpose statement can be broad. It doesn't have to be specific. Because in the last few years, I've expanded my advocacy to not just include climate change or environmental issues because, well, climate change is all sorts of issues. It's a race issue, it's a gender issue, a class issue, it's a mental health issue, a national security issue. And I want to be able to help all the people in these spaces find their own power. So next slide. This one's going to be a little hard. So let's try this. I know I don't think anybody should do this. This can take weeks, to figure out, but I would love for you to try at a purpose statement. So it would be, I am using my powers as blank to do blank. Does anyone do it? We'll give like a 20-second pause. Liz is using her superpower to get people outside more and to laugh more. Okay, I love that. An is using her power as a student to give voice to the youth and learn as much as I can to be part of the progressive generation. Okay, I love that. Thanks, An. Okay, Nicey says, I'm using my superpowers in trust-based relations and investigative thinking to understand the current environmental and community issues on a deeper level and to come up with creative solutions that directly benefit the planet as a whole. Too heavy? No, of course not. Madison is using her powers as a mediator to push people to have difficult environmental and social conversations and make change. Wow, I love that. Anna says, I'm using my powers as an advocate and creator to restore local habitat and progress in my area. Okay, wow, you guys did a great job. I took weeks to do this. You guys took a few minutes. All right, next slide. So a little homework to end the presentation. I want everyone to, sign off today and, craft their origin story and try it out with a friend. Because this is actually a really great rhetorical tool in your advocacy toolkit to get an audience to take action. Second, I want you to just list your identifiers and then start self-reflecting on how they shape your perspective. Thirdly, I want you to look for the patterns in your life and identify your superpowers. I know this is really hard to do, but you have had these superpowers since as long as you've been born. My sister is in this chat, and I think she would say, I'm definitely a maverick. I never followed the rules. And then lastly, try to write out your purpose statement using what we just did. I'm using my powers of blank to blank. And, keep adjusting this as time goes on. And I think the more you write it down, the more you will really understand your purpose and what you're doing here. So next slide. So just final thoughts to leave you all. Climate change is scary. It's very scary and it's very daunting. But throughout history, we have overcome a lot. We've ended segregation. Women got themselves the right to vote. And we are so close to seeing the end of this pandemic. And just like the pandemic, it's going to take all of us to solve climate by 2030. And all heroes have an origin story, identities, superpowers, and purpose, and they're all connected. And you might not leave here like really understanding your connection, the connection of all these things, but at least you know that maybe it's something to start looking for, and that's totally fine. I'll tell you, I created this presentation this week, so it took me, I just came up with this myself, so I'm still figuring out my superpower. And lastly, to be a hero and to save the day, you have to actually show up and do the work. And so I hope that after you leave here today, you find out ways to be a superhero, but also find ways to actively show up. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Okay, so that concludes our panelist presentations. Now we're going to go into the Q&A portion of tonight. So it looks like we've already got some questions coming in. And as a reminder, you can put any questions you have for any of the panelists into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Or if you'd prefer to speak out loud, I think you can raise your hand or put in the chat that you'd like to speak, and I can give you permission to turn your microphone on. So we're going to get started with a couple questions that were sent in ahead of time. And the first is about divestment. So the question is UNL divesting from its holdings of fossil fuel companies, and why would they want to hang on to these investments? So maybe Vivian, if you could give like a background on just what divestment is maybe, and
Sure.
like the work you've done with that, I think that would be like a good start.
Yeah. So divestment is let's see. It is a way, it's like essentially similar to boycotting. So divestment was first used to end apartheid in South Africa. So what happened was that people who did not want, people started pulling their money out of companies that were supporting apartheid in South Africa. And so environmental activists have kind of taken a similar approach, at least in the university space, to start looking at their university foundations, because as you guys might know, universities, we have like sponsors and people who fund programs, and they're from corporations and businesses and all sorts of foundations. And so we want UNL to essentially divest from fossil fuel companies as a way to tell fossil fuel companies, hey, we do not support this anymore. Yeah, so that's essentially what it is. And it's definitely a growing concept because this is something that all universities can easily do. We know that we can put our money in something that is better for the future, like renewables. You know, there's so many different technologies out there that actually do good. So we should be putting our money there. You know, we're a university. We're supposed to be about higher thinking. We should think better with our money as well. And so the divestment movement at UNL first started, I don't know, in 2012, but I know that Sustain UNL and other folks out there are still running the torch. So I'm proud of you guys.
Yeah, just as an update on what's going on with divestment right now, the Board of Regents controls some of the funds, and so they'll be having a meeting this Friday that people are planning on testifying at. So it's a very hot topic. So the next question that we received ahead of time is about Biden's proposed infrastructure plan, and the question is, does the new proposed infrastructural plan offer an American climate change resolution? And what role do you think the states can play in the global fight against greenhouse gases?
Well, I can just say that I haven't had a chance to review the proposed infrastructure plan. I don't even know if it's actually circulating yet, but I have had a chance to review Biden's, his advisors' climate strategy that they proposed even before he took office, and it's incredibly inspiring and wide-ranging. So I know that this infrastructure plan does include several things related to climate, like support for renewables and yeah, renewable energy, and I'm not sure what else. But I know that Biden will probably have a multi-pronged approach to climate, so I don't think that this is the climate plan from the administration. I expect that he will be working on it on a variety of fronts. And I don't know if Vivian or Tim, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I don't know too much about it either, but I know that climate change is woven into a lot of different priority areas. But yeah, so I know that there's some work on, you know, re-energizing the grid, of course, and then like different tax breaks for electric vehicles, and then yeah. So I know that's out there. I'm not familiar with it myself, but I know it's a huge priority.
And I guess I would just add that this kind of references the comments I made in my earlier statement, is that the state of Nebraska should be playing a leadership role on this, but we're not. And so what happens then? Do you just throw in the towel? No. You elect somebody like Lirian Gaylor Baird mayor, and you start doing something that is going to absolutely impact this state in terms of changing the culture. What Lincoln has just done with the Climate Action Plan, which Kim Morrow was instrumental in the creation of, all right, this is going to be a template for everybody. You have now got the capital city in Nebraska signed on to climate change, even though the governor of the state is a denier. Omaha could do the same thing. You could have the two metropolitan areas in the entire state setting the stage for what needs to happen next in this state. You know, after Donald Trump got elected in 2016, a lot of us, you know, instinctively threw up our hands in despair, all right, because he announced that he was going to pull us out of the Paris Agreement. And then you had all of these mayors and all these governors from across the United States saying, we're still in. He can pull us out, but we're still in. We're going to follow the pledges and so forth. This is what we can do now, is you take what life deals with, and then you mold it in a way that is going to make the most that you possibly can out of the scenario. And so at some point, Pete Ricketts isn't going to be governor any longer, all right? And at some point, you know, we're going to have other opportunities. Nebraska's legislature has wrestled with trying to get a climate action plan adopted a couple of times now, and it's gone down in flames both times. But what did we do instead? We passed one in Lincoln, and we're going to start chipping away at this cultural opposition, and we're going to get it. It's going to happen. History's on our side on this one. The facts are going to bolster what we're saying, and the climate, you know, as it continues to disintegrate around us, is going to be making the case for us. So this is just a time to double down.
Yeah, thank you for those answers. Our next question is for Kim. So the question is, Lincoln has a goal of 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. LES set a similar goal, but with more urgency for net zero emissions by 2040. Does that disconnect cause any concern? Is the extra decade because vehicle emissions are tough to tackle?
Yeah, great question, and thank you for that. To be honest, when we were working on the climate action plan, we expected LES to adopt a goal that was also aligned with 2050. And then when they came out with 2040, I was honestly happily surprised. I was like, wow, they're moving on this. So that was great news. We did not really seriously consider a 2040 goal, although I certainly understand the urgency of reducing emissions as quickly as possible. But when it comes to a thorough investigation of all of the systems that the city has in place right now and how quickly we can realistically shift those, and as the questioner noted, in the transportation sector in particular, when there's so much that depends on individual choice. And then in addition, you have things like heavy duty vehicles, and you have waste emissions, and you have our wastewater treatment plant, you have methane emissions. Some of these things are going to be very difficult to change on the short term. So we felt that 2050 was a more realistic goal for the overall citywide reduction goal.
That makes sense. Our next question is for Vivian. So the question is, did you always feel confident in your decision to bounce around the different fields in environmentalism? And what helped you build confidence in your story despite the opinions of others?
No, I would say I was rarely confident because, well, I don't really think it was about confidence because I was so driven by my curiosity to learn. So it really, like at the time, I didn't really care. But then, you know, as your resume starts getting longer, you're like, oh, wow, this is definitely a pattern of me trying different stuff all the time. So I don't think that I was not confident, but the other nice thing about being a young person is that people will give you the benefit of the doubt because you're learning. How are you supposed to know that you want to do wildlife or sustainability or forestry or whatever if you don't try it? So that's why I did it, because I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do. So yeah, I think for me it was more about the journey, and of course, like, I did want stability, but I thought it was more fun to, you know, bounce around and do whatever I wanted. What was the next question? What helped you build your confidence in your story? Because I think I realized that, you know, some people, maybe they stay in their job for 20 years and that is impressive. But I think I had a lot to offer too, by being able to fit into these different sectors and really learn about, like, hey, this is what the forestry people are saying. This is what the fish people are saying, to kind of at least be able to like advocate and connect different communities. So I never really saw as a hindrance, but I was always worried that it could be. So I think it was all about just how you brand yourself and your own journey.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can see how being that connector can be like a really valuable thing. Our next question is for Kim. So it's, long-term planning can be difficult. What are some of the strategies you've had throughout the planning process to keep you grounded?
Thanks for that question, Brittany. I'm kind of wondering if you meant like for me personally to stay grounded, or if you meant like, were there kind of low-hanging fruit strategies that didn't depend on long-term planning? So maybe I guess I could answer both. Oh, you said personally or both. Okay. Personally, yeah, I've been working on climate change for directly for about 11 years now, and it does get difficult. I will not deny that. Sometimes it's just, especially during the pandemic, it just, because, those of us who study climate know how serious and how bad this is. And then you had the pandemic, and then you had Donald Trump, and it was just like, it was really, a dark, dark vision. And then you had the wildfires in the West. I mean, it was really bad. So I think for me, being in nature really helps me. I have a little pond in my backyard, and sometimes I just leave a meeting and go look at my fish. Or I also planted a vegetable garden last year, and that made me so happy and helped me learn so much about my little eco-region here and about plants and stuff. So I think, ironically, those of us who are, well, it's not ironic, but those of us who are working for the natural world, I find that spending time in the natural world is the best like tonic to keep going.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Another one for you, Kim. Is there a plan in the city's action plan for compost collection to keep it out of landfills?
Yes, that's one of the recommendations of the plan. The city is working on updating their solid waste management plan right now. I don't believe that, instituting a citywide compost collection is something that's that they're planning on doing anytime soon, but it definitely needs to be on the horizon for the future, so we can address those methane emissions and remove a lot of waste from the landfill. Food waste is I believe it's the second largest, or maybe it's the first largest now since the cardboard ban went into effect, but it makes up a huge portion of what goes to the landfill currently. So we need to switch how that's being done.
So a question for all of you maybe, or anyone who wants to take it. What role has activism played in making Nebraska more climate friendly, and how much more potential is there for activism?
I can go first. I think there's a lot. I think there's so much more room, but I think I'm just talking on the university level. I think that if us, like 5 students back in the day, didn't do something, I don't think an Office of Sustainability would exist today, which the Office of Sustainability exists because we showed that there was a demand, like an institutional need to make sustainability a thing on campus, because students only stay for 4 years. We can't keep running the whole university. So I think activism is huge. Like, even if for 4 years, you could do a lot at UNL, a lot.
And I can add to that too. I used to be a climate advocate also, and I moved to Nebraska in 2010 from California. And I was on the advocacy side for a long time, working alongside giants like Tim Rinne and lots of people who came before me. But I think all of those climate activists, we really shifted the conversation, and we demanded accountability, from the boards of the public power districts, for example. And we started that process of trying to get bills introduced in the legislature to create a statewide climate action plan. And I think there's a huge role going forward. I mean, you need to hold people like me and Mayor Lyrian accountable, right? Now that this climate action plan has been adopted, we need people asking next year and the year after and the year after, how are you doing on those climate goals, Lincoln? Let's see the data, you know, and that's going to be really important going forward. And there's just so much more work to be done. And as Tim said, I think we all need to be smart about making change wherever we can. Sometimes I like to think of it like the analogy of water, like moving downhill, you know, if there's a rock, it'll just find a way around it. If there's a stick, you know, it just goes over it. And you need to be like water in how you approach climate in Nebraska. And so if you run into a rock that is peat rickets, go a different direction. You know, just keep going, keep pushing every way you can.
Yeah, and I will just wrap up with this and say that it's you guys who are the next greatest generation that are going to carry this. All right. Some of us have been doing our little part up to this point and so forth, but your generation is going to make the difference. If we're going to get a handle on this, it's going to be because of what you folks do. And activism is the core of all of this. Things just follow their own typical path. They just plod forward. We muddle onward. Okay. Unless there were agents out there, activists that are out there that are nudging and are directing things. And that's what you guys can do on this. You know, 10 years ago, and Kim can remember this, and Vivian will remember this. Nobody talked about global warming or climate change in Nebraska. You couldn't get anybody to talk about it. They didn't, okay? And so those of us that started talking about it, we were outliers. We were renegades and all this and so forth. Today, it's like, oh yeah, sure, okay, now we're talking, you know, about, you know, this stimulus bill, okay, or an infrastructure bill, and there's gonna be all this stuff because we have to battle climate change and all that. That's not how it was. It wasn't even in the lexicon. It wasn't part of the vocabulary. And now it is. How did that happen? Because people started making good noise. So that's what I want from you folks. Please, please make good noise. All right.
Thank you for that, Tim. So our final question is for Vivian. What is one piece of advice you have for soon-to-be graduates like myself entering the real world?
Yeah, so I think the best piece of advice I could give to students is to take care of yourself first, actually, because climate change is going to be there tomorrow and next month, next year. But you really have to take care of yourself, because when I was an undergrad, I filled up every single day with meetings, with events, because I felt like, you know, I felt like it was what I had to do because nobody was doing it. But then I got really burnt out, and I almost, you know, I would have maybe not been in this industry for much longer if I didn't give myself a rest. So I think just know that you can take care of yourself and also do good in the world. So yeah, don't kill yourself over this. There's a lot of life to live outside of this movement too.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for, unless anyone has any closing remarks they'd like to make.
Okay. I do. I want to thank Amelia, okay, because this would not have happened if she hadn't been out here rounding us all up and directing us and getting us into the corral when we needed to be into the corral. And so everybody needs to do a big clap for Amelia. Thank you for this.
Well, I really appreciate that. I'd like to thank all of you. It wouldn't have been possible to have this without our wonderful panelists and all of the time that you all have put into this and all of the thought. So I really appreciate that. And I'd also like to thank everybody for coming tonight. You know, thank you for your thoughtful questions, for participating in the chat. I hope that everybody is leaving here tonight feeling a little more inspired and educated to work towards solving climate change in Nebraska. So have a good evening, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.